Welcome to Romance Studies 202, Literature and Culture from Modernism to the Present. And it is my great pleasure and our privilege to have with me here Mark Polizzotti to discuss André Breton's Nadja. Mark Polizzotti is the publisher and editor-in-chief at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New
Mhm.
York. He has written extensively and translated extensively, but for our purposes, perhaps most relevant is he wrote a biography of Breton, A Revolution of the Mind, the life of André Breton. And also recently, this year, in fact, he retranslated André Breton's Nadja, a new translation, the first one in 60 years or so. Mark, thank you so much for being part of this, for being prepared to have this conversation. And I want to start by asking, how would you suggest approaching this text?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. I think that there are a number of levels on which Nadja can be approached, which is probably why we're still reading it today, almost 100 years after it was first published. On the one hand, it's the story of an incredible encounter, a kind of a love story, although I have my reservations about that term for this. Um, but it's the story of Breton, the author's meeting with this young woman who he is fascinated by, I think infatuated with at a certain point, very troubled by, but who also amazes him because she seems to be to him, and he says so at one point, the embodiment of the surrealist mindset, the surrealist ethos, everything that they have been talking about in terms of how to live surrealist, she seems to just naturally embody. So that's one piece of it. It's the core of the book. It's the part I think most people find the most fascinating because it's a day by day account in incredible detail of their 9 days together, which is really all it lasts. The other way to look at this book, the other way to approach it is a kind of a manifesto of surrealism. Breton had written the Manifesto of Surrealism, the first one in 1924, so 4 years before Nadja came out. It is considered to be the official launching of the movement, although that's a very fluid date. But if you have to place it somewhere, it's October 15th, 1924, which was the pub date of the Surrealist Manifesto. But Nadja is, in its own way, a manifesto of what Surrealism was trying to achieve and what it was trying to accomplish and what it was trying to promote, because it's really about the notion of what he would come to term objective chance or petrifying coincidence. In other words, those moments of absolute marvel, unexpected, life-changing in many ways, thrilling in many ways, that really go to penetrate you to the core, and that he felt were available to anybody and, at any place at any time, as long as you were open to them. That's not to say that it was going to happen at every single instant that you walk down the street, but that it could happen at any moment, whatever it is, he says. But the problem with most people is that they were concerned with their job or their family life or this and that, these various distractions that he felt were sort of the soul deadening aspects of, let's say, European life, French life at the time. And that Surrealism's project was to try to resensitize people to that sense of wonder that they felt you had as a child, when everything is new and everything is being sort of absorbed, when, as a friend of mine used to say, your wow buttons are on. So it's also about that. And he sets it up with what some people just consider to be this kind of weird, meaningless preamble of these various episodes in his life, these vignettes, where he talks about little moments of petrifying coincidence, whether it could be something that happened to him when he was walking down the street with a friend, or the way he met certain people who would become then, very important in his life or important in surrealism or whatever it might be. He's setting up the context that gives Nadja, the story of Nadja, his meeting with Nadja, its meaning. Um, and then the third thing is really it's an autobiography. It's a memoir. And I stress this because Nadja is often described as a novel. And it's ironic because Breton himself hated fiction, really had very little use for it. He even goes on a kind of a little mini diatribe in one of the introductory um, sections about psychological literature and all that old-fashioned stuff and how basically that's all dead and outmoded. And he says, I insist on naming the names. I want people to see things as they really happen. And to partly to try to promote that, to buttress it, he included a number of photographs in the book that he had commissioned in most cases of either, people or places or things that were important scattered throughout so that you actually see the illustration of these things that he's talking about. And so, the idea was really, it was almost a kind of a case study or, a reportage, much more than, certainly than anything fictional. And the fact is, we do now know, as people did not at the time, that that Nadja was real, who she was, a fair amount of her life story, and that basically the encounter that he described happened pretty much in that way. Now, I'll say that with one small caveat, which is there are little liberties that he takes, and interestingly, the one person who is not depicted in the book is Nadja herself. So even though she's the central character here, and even though he'll have a picture of Paul Eluard, a picture of Robert Desnos, and a picture of these other people who he'll mention, the one person who's not actually shown is Nadja, partly to protect her privacy, but I think also partly to keep it a little bit gauzy in that regard, to sort of, I don't want to say obfuscate, but to keep a little bit of a veil of mystery over that central part of the story.
You've raised so many things. This is really great. I want to pick up on a few of them now. So one is the notion that this is a book that does many different things. It's sort of a hybrid book. You said it's both a sort of love story, a story of an infatuation. It's a manifesto. It's a sort of
Mhm.
artistic, aesthetic, political, perhaps, manifesto of surrealism, and it's an autobiography, and also this hybrid in the level of genre, mixing visual art, photography, but
Mhm.
also drawings and text. And I'd add, and I wonder if you could say a little bit about this, perhaps. I'd say it also is very self-aware, perhaps
Mm.
because of that. Nadja, as you say, Nadja doesn't get introduced until quite a way through, but we're being prepared for it. We're being told Nadja's coming,
Mhm.
and there's this sense of yeah, awareness about what he's doing in the book. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree with that. It is very self-aware and it's very aware as well of, I, Breton, as the primary actor in this movement that I am now the front man for, um, with an agenda and with a program, you might say. And this was a way of trying to, it's a kind of a press release when you get down to it for the movement, because what it does is illustrate exactly what it was that surrealism was trying to promote, which was this notion that one way out of the deadening aspects of their contemporary life, was to dive back into this openness, this notion of the marvelous in everyday life, and that you didn't have to induce it with drugs. You didn't have to, wait until you're dead to go to paradise, kind of thing. That it could all be here, but you needed to be open to it. And look, here's an example. I was wandering down the street one day, just sort of musing about the people that I was seeing, and this woman starts coming toward me, and immediately I recognize that there's something extraordinary about her. He focuses a lot on her eyes. What was so extraordinary about those eyes? And to the point where he actually just goes up and talks to her, and they engage in conversation. He takes her out for coffee, and she begins to immediately dives in and begins to tell him these details of her personal life and her background and all these different things. And he just becomes completely, um, take it sucked in, completely absorbed in this story, to the point well, to the point where, it really becomes almost kind of dangerous. And in fact, toward the end of the book, he's got this one little mention where, so he and Nadja basically see each other pretty much every day for a period of 9 days, and then he breaks it off shortly after they actually become lovers. And he has this mention of, as they were driving back to Paris, she puts her hands over his eyes and presses his foot down on the gas. And, he says very candidly, I was not up to that. I was not up to that moment. I was not up to what she was asking me to do, which was to just, let it all happen and probably mash against a tree in this sort of eternal kiss of oblivion. And, he said, I couldn't do that. So you can sort of imagine him ripping her hands off of his eyes and getting control of the wheel. Um, and shortly after that, in fact, they stopped seeing each other on a regular basis. It wasn't actually the end of the relationship itself, but it's the end of the relationship in the book. Um, and but he does analyze a fair amount, and he is one of the things that I appreciate is that he's pretty honest about the fact that he's kind of a jerk. And he will even say at a certain point, my that initial fascination, he was trying to sort of maintain it. And after a couple of days, he said, it was sort of variable. Like there were times when she was still really interesting, and there were times when it just like she just droned on, and I was really bored. And I was really bored because she wasn't paying attention to me. And so, he's sort of aware of the fact that he's not exactly a stellar actor in this thing. The other thing, which is interesting, is that he so then later in the book, after they've stopped seeing each other and he's musing on the meaning of what his relationship with Nadja was, he says, "Well, they come to tell me that Nadja has gone insane and she's been committed to an asylum," as if this were just this kind of news that that sort of came to him out of the blue, and and then he goes on to talk about, I never really saw anything that was. She was extraordinary, but I never saw anything that was, that could get her committed. She just seemed to be a really interesting person. Da, da, da. But he sort of admits that he didn't have the courage to try to go and see her in the asylum. And eventually, she was, at her family's request, she was transferred to another asylum in the north of France, which is where she came from, so that they could visit her on a more regular basis. The reality is, recently come to light, that he actually did try to go see her, and there are letters between him and various authorities at the St. Anne Psychiatric Hospital that show that he actually took steps to try to go see her and was not able to do that. So it's interesting that at times even his lucid self-analysis will almost kind of paint a darker picture of himself than was true.
So in some ways, he portrays himself as more of a jerk than
Yeah,
than
right.
he actually was. Um, I want to pick up on something you. I want to pick up on various things, but one thing you were just saying about the sort of danger, or so you describe surrealism as an attempt to rediscover the marvelous in the everyday, perhaps, right? To go back to, in the face of this sort of deadening modernity, everyday life, perhaps of the contemporary city, the openness to chance and to coincidence, to rediscover, I think you said, a sort of childlike
Mhm.
wonder. But as you say, especially in that moment where they're driving along and she puts her hands over his eyes and starts to kiss him while he's driving, he fears there's something also dangerous and frightening at the roots here. I wonder if you
Yeah,
could say a bit more about that.
absolutely. I mean, and that really was part and parcel of, that's the flip side of the surrealist enterprise from the start. Uh, in the 1924 Manifesto, Breton says that surrealism acts on the mind very much as drugs do. It creates frightful needs. So he was aware of the fact that there was this kind of addictive quality to, the farther you push it, the more out of control you get. And there was a kind of an addictive quality to this and a dangerous quality. And one good example of that is in 1922, even before the launching of the Surrealist movement itself, but as it was beginning to sort of coalesce among the people who would eventually become the Surrealists, they initiated what were called these seances or the sleeping fits, they called them. And what these were essentially hypnotic sessions, a little bit like seances that were happening among spiritualists at the time. This was very much in vogue in France, but they weren't trying to contact the dead. They were basically trying to contact themselves, their own unconscious. So what would happen is that certain people would go into these trances and begin to just spew out these incredible stories or these, this spontaneous flow of language that was unlike anything that they'd ever heard. And at first, they were absolutely hypnotized by this. And Breton's wife, Simone Breton, who was, thanks to her, we have a lot of the information that we have about the early days of surrealism. She was a marvelous chronicler of this. She wrote to her cousin, she said, every night after these sessions, we're so broken and exhausted that we can't imagine doing it again. And yet the next day, we can't wait to get back there, and they would do
Mhm.
it night after night after night. So there was this wonderful mining of the marvelous, but at the same time, there was a dangerous aspect because as it went on, you had things like one of them chasing another one in a trance state around the house with a steak knife, trying to stab him in the back, or one of them trying to get various other people to hang themselves from the coat rack, So there was this kind of flip side to it that actually had a real darkness, and to the point where Breton then had to cut the experiment short. And some of the people who had been the most assiduous participants in this and the ones who would go under every night found it very hard to take. It really was like a withdrawal. Um, and one of them in particular, I mean, just was, showing up at 3 in the morning, pounding on his door, put me to sleep, that kind of thing. It really was like a drug addict saying, I need my fix. And so, there is that side of it. Another example is one of the early surrealists, Antonin Artaud, who is, if he's known to you, probably more for his work in theater. He's the author of a absolutely fascinating book called The Theater and Its Double, which is one of the seminal texts of modern dramaturgy. And Artaud he was one of the first members of the group, but he himself, if anybody lived surrealist, it was certainly much more Artaud than it was Breton, who had a
Mhm.
very regular kind of lifestyle. And the problem with, and unfortunately Artaud eventually did get committed to an asylum and was diagnosed as schizophrenic and did spend the last years of his life in an asylum during the war. Um, and, finally emerged from it after the war, but he went in looking like this handsome young man who had been in these movies, and came out of it looking like this old crone in the space of, 10 years. He aged like 50 years. Um, so that in a way was kind of a warning lesson as well, that this is not free, that there's a price to be paid for doing this. And a point that I like to make is that it probably took someone like Breton, who had, in fact, from the outside, you could look at it as a fairly bourgeois lifestyle. I mean, he never had steady work, but he was not a late to bed person. He didn't
Mhm.
like nightlife. He didn't go out to nightclubs. He didn't do drugs. He had a pretty regular lifestyle. He lived in the same apartment building from, 1920 till his death in 66. Um, it probably took somebody like that to keep surrealism going for almost 50 years. You needed that control. And the fact that he also had a certain personal charisma that sort of kept the various factions together. Somebody like Artaud or Desnos or someone like that who was much closer to practicing what they were preaching burned out really fast.
So we're almost out of time, but there's one more thing that I do want to get to, and it connects a few things that you've been saying and we've been talking about. So on the one hand, even though the book's called Nadja, in many ways it's about Breton.
Hmm.
It's an autobiography. In many ways, I mean, it begins with the words "Who am I?"
Hmm.
Um, it's self-aware, but in some ways, arguably self-obsessed.
Mm.
And I know that when I taught this before, my students thought of when they read Nadja, the figure of Nadja as a fantasy that they compared to this figure of the manic pixie dream girl, a sort of
Hmm.
a, a fantasy of a young, free-spirited girl invented for the purpose of the male gaze.
Mm.
And I want to connect that also to when you said that. There's photos, there's depictions of many of the people involved, except for Nadja.
Hmm.
But that's not quite true insofar as we have a picture, we have some of her art, and
Of her art.
including a self-portrait that she draws of herself. So I wonder, do we hear from? I mean, in what way? In what ways, for instance, do those pictures or the quotations from Nadja? Do we hear from do we hear what do we hear from Nadja in this book?
You hear a lot.
Not
You
merely
hear
a
a lot.
projection of Breton.
Yeah, no, see, I think it's important draw a distinction there. She is a real person. She's not a projection of him. She's not a projection of the male gaze. She really did exist. Her name was Leona Camille Ghislaine Delcourt. We know a lot at this point about her life. Uh, I think one of the accomplishments of the book, even though it is, of course, about him, and even though it is self-obsessed to a certain extent, and also about Paris, it's very much a book about Paris as well, which we shouldn't forget. But Nadja herself comes through as this really engaging, fully fleshed character. I mean, I think that that is one of his accomplishments as a writer, Breton's, is that she's not a cardboard character. She's not sort of a two-dimensional person. As I was translating this book, I could hear her talking in my head. She really comes through the page, and their conversations really come through the page. But especially, she would often they were not so much conversations as monologues, but he renders them so well, and I think convincingly. I can't say faithfully, I wasn't there, but I think convincingly. And it's interesting too. We now have the manuscript of Nadja, and it's been reproduced in facsimile, so it was something I was able to consult. There really are very few changes between the manuscript and the printed version. A few stylistic things here and there. Now, I should say very quickly that there was another edition of Nadja that Breton published during his lifetime in the 1960s, a few years before he died, where he made changes. He airbrushes out a little bit of the detail. The most notable one is the explicit reference in the original edition, which is the one that I translated from, of the two of them spending a night in a hotel, where you know that they've become lovers. That sort of gets elided in the 1963 edition. But what he adds, to your point, John, is a photograph not of Nadja herself, but of her eyes, uh, reproduced in four repetitive strips. So, in fact, there is something that he did add to that second revised edition, which is a kind of a sort of a portrait of Nadja, along with her self-portrait and her drawings. And now that we have a photograph of Nadja, which I put as a frontispiece in the translation, you realize that that's exactly the photograph that he used. Those are the exact same eyes that he used for his book.
Well, we could, there's much more that we could discuss. This has been a fascinating conversation, but we are out of time. Mark Polizzotti, thank you so much for this, for sharing of your knowledge and understanding and experience working so closely with the text to translate it.
Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks.